Don't destroy the family over a mistake, Dad said after my brother slept with my fiancée. I nodded, cut their funding, and let the law do the rest. Original post. I want to be unequivocally clear about something before I get into the weeds of this nightmare. I am not writing this because I need sympathy, and I am certainly not writing this to process my trauma. I am writing this because the full, unvarnished picture of what happened start to finish, every agonizing detail is the kind of thing that needs to exist somewhere outside of my own head. So, here it is. My real name doesn't matter, but you can call me Liam. What matters is that I built something real. I was 24 years old when I started my company. We specialize in cold chain medical logistics, automated temperature-controlled transport systems, secure routing for sensitive biologics, and operational consulting for pharmaceutical distribution. It is not glamorous. It is not the kind of thing you explain at a dinner party without watching someone's eyes glaze over into a comatose stare. But it is profitable in ways that most exciting industries could never even dream of. I had spent 3 grueling years after college working a soul-crushing warehouse job during the day, while doing inventory audits for a small medical supplier on nights and weekends. I saved exactly $6,000. I knew one guy with a regional pharmacy operation who needed better cold storage sourcing and couldn't afford a full vendor relationship. I became that vendor for him. Then I became that for 3 more like him. Then I hired someone. Then 2 more people. Then I stopped counting employees and started counting multi-state contracts. By the time I was 29, the business was pulling 7 figures annually. By 32, which is where this story truly begins, I had 22 full-time staff members, active contracts across 4 states, and a pristine reputation in a highly lucrative niche industry. I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't take venture capital investors who wanted board seats and control. I owned it completely, and I ran it the exact same way I built it, carefully, methodically, and without making unnecessary noise. The money changed things for my family. It happened gradually at first, and then all at once. My father, Arthur, had retired from municipal contracting the year I turned 27. He had done fine for himself over the decades, but retirement thinned their financial margins incredibly quickly. My mother, Helen, did part-time administrative work for a local real estate office. It was enough to keep her busy, but nowhere near enough to cover their actual living expenses. When my business started producing real, life-altering money, I didn't make a massive production out of helping them. I just quietly did it. Arthur needed a new truck because his transmission blew. I handled it. The roof and the kitchen in their aging house had been falling apart for a decade. I had them completely gutted and renovated. Small things at first, then much bigger ones. The biggest one was the house itself. It was a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial with a decent-sized yard in a neighborhood that had appreciated steadily over the years. I bought it outright in cash when I was 28. I put their names on the occupancy registry, but I held the deed. I covered the property taxes, the utilities, the HOA fees, and the maintenance without ever making it a monthly conversation. It was their home, I just happened to own the physical structure. That was simply how things worked in my head at the time. I was providing. Then, my older brother Marcus moved back into that house about 18 months before everything completely collapsed. Marcus is 38, 6 years older than me, and he possesses a unique, terrifying gift for being between opportunities in a way that always sounds temporary but never quite is. His previous venture had been some kind of crypto-adjacent startup that never gained an inch of traction. Before that, it was a drop-shipping franchise arrangement that spectacularly fell apart. He has charm. The specific kind of aggressive charm that works flawlessly on people who refuse to look at historical patterns. I looked at the pattern, I knew exactly who he was, and I helped him anyway because he was my brother and that felt like what a good son was supposed to do. I put Marcus on my company payroll as a compliance consultant. It was a low-level role, mostly vendor coordination, nothing that touched core corporate financials. It gave him an income that looked entirely legitimate on paper. In exchange, he had access to secondary vendor accounts and a company credit line meant strictly for minor operational purchases. I genuinely thought I was giving him a stable foothold to rebuild his life. I wasn't watching him closely enough to see what he was actually doing with that foothold. Then there was Elena. I met her at a corporate compliance seminar 3 years before all of this went down. She was working as a corporate auditor at the time. She was a phenomenally sharp dresser, impeccably good at reading rooms, and incredibly comfortable navigating conversations that other people found intimidating or difficult. We were in the same breakout session. She made a point about regulatory loopholes that I fundamentally disagreed with, and I told her so directly in front of the room. She laughed instead of getting defensive. I liked that immediately. We dated for 2 wonderful years before I proposed. She said yes without a single second of hesitation. I believed every single part of it. 8 months into our engagement, she abruptly left her auditing job and started describing her new work as independent consulting. The details were always incredibly vague whenever I asked. Client confidentiality, she would say. I'm still getting the LLC established, it's complicated. I let it go because my business was in a massive expansion phase, I was working 80-hour weeks, and I trusted her completely. That trust was a fatal error. The wedding was exactly 4 months out. The luxury venue was booked. The massive deposits were paid across the board. We had Sunday dinners at my parents' house every single week. Elena and my mother Helen got along famously. Marcus was always making the table laugh with his exaggerated stories. Arthur was always topping up everyone's wine glasses. Everything looked exactly like it was supposed to look. It was the perfect family portrait. I came home early on a random Tuesday afternoon. A massive client meeting had been abruptly cancelled, so I decided to take the rest of the day to decompress. Marcus's truck was parked in my driveway, which wasn't entirely unusual. He stopped by the house regularly to drop off paperwork or grab a beer. I didn't think anything of it. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, heard a specific kind of sound, and stood completely still in the foyer for a second while my brain desperately tried to catch up with what my ears were telling it. Then, I walked down the hardwood hallway toward the master bedroom. The door was open about 3 inches. I pushed it the rest of the way open and stood silently in the doorframe. I have replayed that exact moment in my head 1,000 times since it happened. What I saw in that room didn't break me. What actually broke me was what happened in the 2 hours immediately after. Specifically, what my own parents chose to say to me before I even had time to breathe through the shock. Elena saw me first. She went completely, terrifyingly still. It wasn't the stillness of genuine shock or panic, it was the stillness of rapid, cold calculation. Marcus turned over slowly, looking exactly like a man who had already started running the mathematical probabilities of his survival before he had even fully registered that I was standing there. Neither of them spoke a single word, neither did I. I stood in that doorframe for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. And then, I said quietly, without raising my voice even a fraction of a decibel, "Get out of my house." That was it. I turned around, walked into the kitchen, and sat down at the marble island. Marcus was dressed and sprinting out the front door in under 2 minutes. On his way through the kitchen, he actually slowed down, looked me dead in the eye, and said the most pathetic sentence I have ever heard. "Bro, it just happened." Like those 4 utterly meaningless words were going to magically fix the universe. I didn't look at him. I didn't respond. I kept my eyes locked on the countertop until I heard the front door slam shut and his truck engine roar to life in the driveway. Elena took a little longer. She eventually came to the kitchen doorway, fully dressed, her eyes artificially red, and said, "Liam, I can explain this." I looked up at her and said, "No, you really can't." She stood there for another agonizing 30 seconds, waiting for me to scream, to cry, to throw something, to say literally anything else. I didn't. So, she left. I sat at that kitchen island for 20 minutes without moving a single muscle. No music, no television, just the hollow sound of the house settling around me. I wasn't in shock, exactly. It was more like the deeply unsettling feeling of a massive calculation finally completing in my head. It was like some buried part of my subconscious had suspected this answer for months and had just been violently handed the empirical confirmation. Then, my cell phone rang. It was my mother. That caller ID alone told me absolutely everything I needed to know about the very first phone call Marcus made from his truck as he peeled out of my driveway. He hadn't called her to cry or apologize. He had called her to get ahead of the narrative. And my mother, Helen, who had eaten dinner at my table every Sunday for years, who had hugged Elena and called her a daughter, opened the conversation with these exact words: "Liam, please. It was a mistake, he's your brother." I didn't reply. I pressed end and set the phone face down. Arthur called exactly 4 minutes later. My father's opening line was much more considered, like he had taken the time to think about the psychological framing. "Son, don't do something rash that destroys this family over one bad decision. Think about what we've built together." That word. Together. I sat in the deafening silence of my kitchen and let that word bounce around in my skull. What exactly had we built times together? The logistics business was entirely mine. Every contract negotiated, every employee hired, every agonizing decision made at 5 a.m. before anyone else in the world was awake, that was me. The house they lived in was mine. The truck parked in my father's garage was mine. The luxury kitchen my mother cooked in every Sunday had been completely gutted and rebuilt using my money. The steady stream of income that funded every single comfortable, insulated corner of all their lives came from exactly one source: me. And yet, the absolute second the people they had chosen to protect over me got violently exposed, suddenly it was a shared structure. Suddenly, there was a together that I apparently had a moral obligation to preserve. Update 1. I didn't sleep a single second that night. Elena came back around 10 p.m. I unlocked the door and let her in solely because I wanted to hear her talk. I wanted to see the exact mechanics of her lies. She gave a long, beautifully rehearsed explanation. She talked about the distance in our relationship due to my work hours. She talked about her profound loneliness. She claimed Marcus had aggressively pursued her. She swore it had only been going on for a few months and that it meant absolutely nothing. The words flowed out of her mouth in that specific, polished way that only happens when someone has been preparing a speech in their head for much longer than the crisis they are currently using it for. I listened to the entire monologue without interrupting once. Then, she said the one sentence that shifted the entire tectonic plate of my reality. Liam, your parents knew things had been strained between us. I talked to your mother about it extensively. She understood. She said it like it was a softening detail, like it would somehow help her case. Helen had known Elena and Marcus had been spending significant time together alone. She had known the relationship was supposedly strained, and she had said absolutely nothing to me, not once, not a single solitary word across dozens of Sunday dinners, casual weekly phone calls, and 100 different opportunities to say something. She had actively chosen to protect their disgusting arrangement over her own son. I didn't scream, I didn't react with anger, I just looked at Elena, and I smiled. It wasn't a sarcastic smile, and it certainly wasn't a warm one. It was just a quiet, deeply settled expression that apparently communicated something so dark she wasn't prepared for it, because she stopped speaking mid-sentence and didn't attempt to start again. She told a mutual friend months later that the smile I gave her that night scared her infinitely more than anything I could have ever shouted. I quietly asked her to leave. She practically ran out the door. I sat completely alone in the dark kitchen until 3 a.m. Then, I opened my laptop. I didn't open it to look at photos or wallow in misery. I opened it to start mapping every single account, asset, liability, access point, and operational dependency in my life. I wanted to see exactly who relied on what, who had access to what, and what the full, unvarnished financial architecture of my existence actually looked like when drawn out on a spreadsheet. Honestly, that was when I found the real betrayal. The cheating was just the appetizer. I found Marcus's name on a secondary vendor credit account that I had absolutely never authorized. He was listed as a secondary signatory on a digital document that bore my signature, except I had never signed it. I went through the last 16 months of financial records with forensic precision. The stolen amounts were small. The intervals were highly irregular. It was brilliantly intentional. It was designed to be small and irregular enough to stay completely below the automated fraud alert thresholds of our accounting software. Over the course of 16 months, Marcus had siphoned exactly $82,500 out of my company. And that was only what I had managed to find in the first hour of digging. By 5 a.m., I had 6 browser tabs open, 3 complex spreadsheets running, and a yellow legal pad completely covered in handwriting that had gotten progressively smaller and tighter as the hours dragged on. I wasn't panicking. That is the thing I really want to emphasize. There was zero panic in my body. What I felt was infinitely closer to the focused, airless, sociopathic calm that washes over you when an abstract emotional problem suddenly becomes a concrete mathematical equation. Abstract betrayal is devastating and messy. Specific stolen numbers are just a logistical problem to solve. I kept pulling the server records. Marcus's embezzlement method was surprisingly straightforward once I understood the underlying logic. He had legitimate vendor account access as part of his consulting role, which meant nobody in accounting ever flagged his logins. When legitimate invoices came in with minor, manufactured overpayments, the standard company practice was to apply that surplus as a rolling credit toward the next bulk order. What Marcus had been doing instead was manually redirecting those specific surpluses to a completely separate dummy shell account through a series of tiny corrective transfers. Individually, they looked like routine, boring reconciliation entries. Nobody reviews reconciliation entries at that microscopic granularity unless they are specifically hunting for a rat. I hadn't been hunting. By the time I mapped the full, exhaustive run of his theft, I stopped being surprised by what I was finding. Then, I seamlessly transitioned to Elena's layer of the nightmare. I pulled the master credit line authorizations first. I found a finalized document with my signature on it, explicitly approving a massive increase to the company's operational credit ceiling. I had absolutely never signed that document. I knew this with 100% certainty because that exact credit increase had been discussed internally with my finance team, and I had firmly decided against it 3 months prior. The discussion was logged in my email archives. The final decision not to proceed was clearly in writing. And yet, there was my signature on a formalized approval document dated 6 weeks after I had explicitly said no. Real, human signatures have natural variation. The pen pressure changes, the angle of the loops shifts slightly, the tail of a letter catches differently, depending on how fast your hand is moving. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over the years, and no two signatures were ever microscopically identical. The signature on that credit document was technically proficient, but it was completely, mathematically consistent with another document I found. It looked exactly the way a signature looks when someone has obsessively practiced tracing it rather than actually living it. The second forged document I uncovered made my blood run entirely cold. It was a partial property asset transfer. It was preliminary legal paperwork that appeared to be slowly moving one of my most valuable business-held commercial properties into a jointly named marital trust structure. It had never fully completed processing. Whatever the intended endpoint was, the timeline had been interrupted by me coming home early. The signature on that transfer document perfectly matched the first forgery. Elena had spent years as a corporate compliance auditor. She was a master with complex documents. She understood exactly how financial paperwork moved through bureaucratic systems and exactly where the oversight gaps were. She hadn't been vague about her new consulting work because the work was boring. She had been vague because her actual full-time job was meticulously dismantling my assets to steal them. I sat back from the glowing laptop screen and stared at the horrifying mosaic I had just assembled. Marcus was aggressively stealing cash. Elena was quietly forging documents to steal real estate. Both of them were operating with enough brazen confidence and consistency to suggest they felt completely safe doing it. And then, I remembered the old family cloud server. I still had administrative access to a shared family Google Drive, a setup from years back that nobody had ever formally closed out or bothered to secure. I opened it, navigated to Helen's personal backup folder, and found an archived email thread from 8 months ago between my mother and Marcus. Helen's line, "Be careful, he'll notice eventually." Arthur's single-word reply from his linked account, "Agreed." Not, "Stop this immediately." Not, "What the hell are you doing to your brother?" Not, "I won't be a part of this." Just, "Be careful." My parents hadn't built the embezzlement structure. But they had absolutely known about it. They had sat down, weighed the moral cost of saying something against the financial cost of saying nothing, and actively chosen silence. Because saying something meant demanding accountability. And demanding accountability meant the immediate end of a luxurious, insulated life that I had been quietly funding for them for years. I closed the laptop at 6 a.m., and calmly brewed a pot of black coffee. While it dripped, I picked up my phone and called my overseas business attorney, a brilliant, ruthless man I had retained 2 years prior when I was exploring expansion into international export markets. He was someone completely outside of my family's knowledge or social orbit. I told him I needed to immediately begin restructuring the company's entire ownership architecture through the foreign registered holding entity we had previously discussed as a contingency during the export planning phase. He paused and asked me how quickly I needed it done. I told him I needed it done as fast as it could be executed without leaving a single legal vulnerability. He said 2 weeks, maybe less if we expedited the filing fees. Over the following 48 hours, I became a ghost operating in plain sight. I contacted a cutthroat real estate attorney and instructed them to immediately list the family home for sale. I priced it highly aggressively, competitive enough to move at lightning speed. The listing went up quietly. I systematically removed Marcus from every single company account, server, and physical access point, framing it internally to my IT department as a routine, randomized security audit, nothing that would raise immediate red flags with the wider staff. I moved every cent of my personal savings into a newly established offshore account that existed entirely outside of my family's awareness or domestic legal reach. I called the luxury wedding venue, coldly canceled the booking, and ensured the massive refund processed directly to my private card only. Then, I meticulously built the evidence file. Every single fraudulent transfer record, both forged signature documents, high-resolution screenshots of the damning email thread, and a clean, chronological timeline detailing exact amounts, dates, and IP addresses. I organized it into perfectly labeled digital folders, one for my investors, one for the extended family, one for Elena's professional network, and one for law enforcement. I saved everything to a heavily encrypted external drive. On the 4th day of my silent war, Elena came to my corporate office. She was incredibly composed. She had clearly taken the time to regroup and strategize. She walked in with the distinct energy of someone who had decided that a direct, reasonable adult conversation was the winning play. She sat across from my massive desk and talked about the lost wedding deposits, about how much social capital had already been committed, and about the tragic disruption to both of our lives. Then, she leaned forward slightly, lowered her voice to a soothing register, and said, "Liam, your parents think the best thing for everyone is to handle this privately. They suggested maybe we all attend family counseling, a structured healing process." She said it like it was a completely neutral suggestion, like she was merely relaying objective information rather than delivering a highly coordinated, manipulative message. But I had the Google Drive thread. I knew exactly how long this particular parasitic team had been in communication. I looked at her across my desk, and I smiled again. The exact same dead, hollow smile from the night she had left my house. She recognized it instantly. I watched her pupils dilate as she registered it, and I watched her brain desperately try to decide what it meant. She didn't reach a conclusion before I politely thanked her for coming in, stood up, and told her I would be in touch. She practically fled the office, looking infinitely more terrified than when she had arrived. That evening, I opened a secure travel app on a burner phone and booked 2 flights. The first flight was under my full legal name, Heading to Chicago. The second flight was booked under my middle name, a name that appeared legally on my passport, but that I had absolutely never used professionally or personally in any context my family would ever recognize. Heading to Charleston, South Carolina. Nobody knew about the second flight. Nobody knew about a lot of things. The final week was the most surreal, out-of-body experience of my life. I went to work every single day, answered routine emails, sat in complex client strategy calls, and handled all of them flawlessly. When Elena texted me asking if we could meet that weekend to talk properly and heal, I casually replied, "Sure, we'll sort something out." She sent back a deeply relieved-sounding response. She genuinely thought that meant progress. Marcus sent a massive, groveling apology text on Wednesday. It was 3 dense paragraphs, beautifully structured, and emotionally calibrated in a sophisticated way that absolutely did not match his usual illiterate writing style. Someone had clearly helped him draft it, almost certainly Helen. I read it once, archived it directly to the law enforcement evidence folder without replying, and went right back to what I was doing. What I was doing was finishing the execution. The offshore ownership restructure officially completed on day 9, significantly faster than the 2 weeks my attorney had originally estimated. My massive logistics company now sat legally insulated inside a foreign registered holding entity, with me listed merely as an appointed officer rather than the named domestic owner. Any future attempt by Elena to claim the business as a shared marital asset in civil litigation would now require navigating an international legal labyrinth that would take years and cost substantially more in legal fees than it could ever possibly produce. It wasn't entirely untouchable, but it was astronomically expensive enough to be functionally out of reach for people without vast resources. Which, as of that specific week, perfectly described every single person in my family. The real estate attorney called on day 10. We had an all-cash offer on the family home that was incredibly close to the asking price. I accepted it immediately. I demanded a standard contract with a brutal 30-day vacate clause for all current occupants, legally enforceable from the exact date of signing. Then began the quiet, systematic dismantling of their lives. I removed my parents from my Verizon family phone plan on a random Tuesday morning. I permanently closed the shared platinum credit card my mother had been using as her personal piggy bank for 2 years. I canceled the weekly HelloFresh grocery delivery account that billed to my card. I canceled the Netflix, Hulu, and Spotify subscriptions. I terminated the expensive insurance rider I had added to cover Arthur's truck. I canceled the HOA fee auto pay. I didn't announce a single piece of it. I didn't send a dramatic message explaining what was happening. These luxurious lifelines had simply been running effortlessly in the background because I had set them up and paid for them. Now, I stopped paying. They would discover each and every severed artery only when they tried to use it and failed. 3 days before I vanished, I called my operations manager, Sarah, my head of client accounts, and my lead logistics coordinator into my office separately and privately. I told each of them the absolute truth in strict professional terms. The company was undergoing a massive ownership restructure due to severe internal fraud. Their roles were fully secure, their salaries were guaranteed under the new structure, and all communications should route exclusively through the updated encrypted chain going forward. I gave each of them a massive retention bonus processed directly through the new foreign entities account. These 3 people I trusted with my life. I also knew that the 4 junior staff members Marcus had spent 2 years aggressively cultivating personal relationships with would likely read the sudden shift in the wind and make their own decisions to leave. That was perfectly fine. I had already accounted for their attrition in the new budget. The final family dinner was entirely my idea. I texted Helen on Thursday and said I wanted to come over for Sunday dinner, that I thought it was finally time to talk and heal. She responded in under a minute, overflowing with heart emojis. When I arrived at the house I legally owned, she had cooked a massive, elaborate feast, the kind of intensive meal that takes most of the afternoon to prepare. Arthur poured expensive scotch before I even sat down at the table. They were incredibly careful with me. Both of them hovered in that specific, delicate way people do when they think the victim is still deciding their fate, and they desperately need the decision to go their way. We talked about forgiveness, about perspective, and about how strong families absorb difficult things and come out the other side united. I asked leading questions that made them feel heard and validated. I ate every single bite of food on my plate. I smiled. At the very end of the evening, Arthur put his heavy hand on my shoulder, looked at me with faux paternal wisdom, and said, "We'll get through this as a family, son." I nodded slowly. I hugged them both. I walked out the door, got in my car, and drove home. Update 2. I loaded exactly 2 duffel bags into my car before 4 a.m. Everything that actually mattered had been quietly staged and shipped gradually over the previous 4 days. Legal documents, encrypted hard drives, and a few irreplaceable personal items that had zero monetary value but that I absolutely wasn't leaving behind. The rest of the house, the expensive furniture, the electronics, the art I left exactly as it was. The dishes were clean in the sink, the lights were off, and absolutely nothing was staged to look like a permanent departure. I drove to the airport in the pitch dark and caught the first flight to Chicago under my legal name. I landed, waited 2 agonizing hours in the bustling terminal, and then boarded the second flight to Charleston under my middle name. I was heading to a colleague's private guest house, arranged entirely through a secure channel that had zero connection to anyone in my family's social or professional world. Nobody had that contact. Nobody knew that name was on a boarding pass. By the time the sun was fully up and shining over the Atlantic, I was completely gone. They figured it out in fragmented pieces, which I imagine was infinitely worse than finding out all at once. Elena arrived at my house mid-morning with coffee, intending to play the loving, repentant fiancé, and found the house locked, dark, and utterly silent. She called my cell number and immediately reached a dead voicemail on a line I had already flagged for permanent cancellation. Marcus got the legal vacate notice delivered via certified mail simultaneously with my parents. It wasn't a heartfelt letter. It was standard, brutal legal correspondence. No personal note, no explanation, just the cold, formal language of a finalized property sale and a strict 30-day eviction timeline. Panicking, he immediately called the corporate office. Sarah, my fiercely loyal operations manager, coldly informed him that his consulting arrangement had been terminated effective immediately due to the new ownership structure, and that he was legally barred from the premises. The 4 junior staff members who had been close to him had already handed in their resignations that very morning rather than navigate the terrifying new corporate chain, which meant he had absolutely zero allies left answering his frantic calls internally. The Verizon phone plan died sometime around noon. Helen tried to use the Platinum credit card at a luxury grocery store at 1 p.m., and it violently declined at the register. She tried to call my number 17 times over the course of the afternoon from a borrowed phone. Arthur's text messages started out measured and authoritative, and devolved into sheer, unadulterated panic by the evening. Elena sent a sobbing, hysterical voice message to the cancelled line that absolutely nobody would ever hear. And then, the massive debt collectors started calling. 2 separate vendors Marcus had been fraudulently deferring payments to under his falsified authorizations were now in aggressive, active collection. The operational credit line I had been quietly servicing through automatic payments went completely unmaintained the exact moment I severed my bank details. And commercial credit lines do not wait patiently. They escalate ruthlessly. By the end of the first week, the collection calls to Marcus were daily. By the end of the second week, they were constant, threatening, and legally binding. Arthur and Helen, who had absolutely never managed the massive financial obligations attached to a luxury property they technically didn't own, had zero framework for what was happening to them, or how to stop the bleeding. I know all of these details because my loyal friend Priya told me later, but that comes after I landed, settled into the beautiful Charleston guest arrangement, made a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop. The master evidence folder sat on my desktop clean, meticulously labeled, and organized into 4 distinct weapons. Investors, extended family, professional network, law enforcement. I opened the law enforcement section first. My ruthless attorney had already drafted the formal criminal complaint. All I had to do was type 2 words to authorize him to file it. I read through the devastating document once, then replied to his email, "Do it." The formal criminal complaint hit the lead detective's desk on a Thursday morning. My attorney filed it with the full, unredacted evidence package attached: the fraudulent transfer records, the hidden reconciliation trail, the forged signature documents, the timeline, everything clean, chronological, and heavily annotated. When you hand financial fraud investigators a massive case that is already 90% built and gift-wrapped, they move with terrifying speed. By Friday afternoon, Marcus had received a terrifying phone call from a detective asking him to come down to the precinct for a conversation. By the following Monday, Elena had a certified letter from the exact same fraud department. I wasn't there to witness any of it. I heard about the panic firsthand, weeks later. At the time, all I knew was that the complaint had been officially filed, and that the brutal machinery of the justice system was now moving entirely on its own momentum. That was the whole point. I didn't need to stay and watch the explosion happen. I just needed to make sure the fuse was lit. The investor drops went out that same week. I had set up a secure Proton Mail alias months prior for dealing with paranoid overseas contacts. I used it now. Both of Elena's largest private investors received the exact same anonymous document, a 4-page forensic audit summary with the damning bank records attached. No emotional editorial, no narrative framing, just the cold, hard transfers, the shell account numbers, the dates, and the stolen amounts. It was clinical enough to look exactly like it had leaked from an internal corporate review rather than a personal vendetta. One investor forwarded it to his aggressive legal team within the same business day. The other called Sarah, who smoothly confirmed the company was undergoing restructuring and that an internal review had identified severe irregularities. That was all she legally had to say. It was more than enough. Their attorneys initiated a formal audit of Elena's consulting firm within the week. The extended family drop was infinitely more personal, and vastly more precise. I sent the forged signature documents and the embezzlement records directly to my Uncle David, my father's older, immensely wealthy brother. He was the kind of terrifying patriarch whose mere presence at any family gathering instantly dictated the tone for how everyone else behaved. He was respected in a way that Arthur had always quietly, bitterly deferred to. I also sent physical copies to two prominent cousins who had been at my engagement party, who had given tearful speeches, and who had looked me in the eye and told me they were so happy for me. I included a brief, polite note with each package. I have been advised by legal counsel to share this context with the family before the impending criminal proceedings become public record. I wasn't asking for their help. I wasn't framing it as a messy family dispute requiring their mediation. I was simply making absolutely sure that the people whose opinions carried the most weight in my parents' superficial world knew the full, unvarnished truth before the courts dragged it into the sunlight anyway. Uncle David stopped returning Arthur's desperate phone calls within 3 days. The cousins quietly, permanently withdrew from the massive family group chat. There were no screaming confrontations, no dramatic announcements, just absence. The specific kind of heavy, suffocating absence that arrives without any explanation and therefore cannot be argued with, bargained with, or managed. For Helen, who had spent decades meticulously maintaining the family's fragile social standing, that deafening silence was its own specific, agonizing punishment. The professional network drop on Elena was the quietest, and by far the most effective. Through a mutual, highly connected contact from my export expansion work, someone with zero personal connection to Elena, but a massive reach in corporate auditing and financial brokerage circles, I made absolutely sure her name was casually attached to the phrase criminal civil matter involving document forgery in all the right whispered conversations. I didn't need to distribute the documents myself. I didn't need to make unhinged phone calls. In elite professional networks built entirely on credentialed trust, dark implication moves 10 times faster than documentation. Within 2 weeks, massive corporate doors were slamming shut in her face in ways she couldn't possibly trace back to a single source. Then, Marcus and Elena did exactly what I had mathematically predicted they would do. They violently turned on each other to save themselves. The absolute second Marcus understood that Elena's forged signatures could legally position him as a co-conspirator in a massive real estate theft rather than just a separate embezzler, he started aggressively distancing himself from her immediately and publicly. He told mutual contacts she had operated entirely independently, that he hadn't known a single thing about the forged documents, that the financial side had been entirely his own isolated situation, and that the two crimes were completely unrelated. Elena found out he was throwing her under the bus within days. Her immediate response was to scorch the earth. She told a mutual friend, someone she desperately trusted, and absolutely shouldn't have, about all the fund redirections, about the hidden vendor account transfers, and about the horrifying fact that she had known for months and stayed quiet because she thought they were leaving together. She actually said that last part out loud. They were leaving together. As in, the master plan had been for both of them to completely drain my life, steal my commercial property, and exit with as much of my empire as they could carry. I heard this through Priya weeks later, and I sat on the porch looking at the ocean for a long time. By month 3, the entire structure of consequences was fully in place and running flawlessly without my involvement. The police investigation was highly active. Marcus and Elena were trapped in separate, terrifying legal situations that their mutual public contradictions were only making worse. The extended family's social withdrawal had become permanent enough that Arthur and Helen had completely stopped expecting it to ever reverse. The aggressive debt collection calls were ongoing. The family home sale had closed, and the new buyers had enforced the eviction. My parents had been forced to desperately scramble and find a tiny, depressing 2-bedroom rental that Arthur's municipal pension could barely cover. I was working, traveling occasionally, and rebuilding the logistics company's structure into something infinitely cleaner, leaner, and more efficient than it had ever been before. Every single week felt more like my own life, and less like the chaotic aftermath of someone else's parasitic decisions. Then, 4 months after I vanished, I logged into an incredibly old email account. It was a college-era address, barely used, kept alive mostly out of digital inertia. I logged in solely to retrieve an old tax document I had stored there years ago. There were 14 unread messages. 13 of them were automated spam. The 14th was from Helen. The subject line read, "I know you won't read this." I almost closed the tab. My hand actually moved toward the trackpad to delete it. Then I stopped, took a breath, and opened it. She had written for a very long time. I read every single word, and at the very end, after everything she said, after the brutal acknowledgement, the deep shame, and the highly specific honesty I had never expected from her, there were 3 words. I sat with them for 20 minutes. Then I made the final decision left to make in this entire saga. The email was massive. Helen had never been a person who wrote at length. Her texts were usually brief, her communication strictly functional. This was entirely different. She had clearly written it over multiple agonizing sittings, maybe over multiple days, because the emotional tone shifted slightly in places the way writing does when the author comes back to it after crying themselves to sleep and sees it differently in the cold morning light. She didn't justify a single thing. That was the very first thing I noticed. There was absolutely no architecture of excuse underneath the words, no careful positioning of blame toward Marcus or Elena to soften her own horrific role in it. She bluntly admitted she had known about the money. Not the full $82,500, not every single transfer, but she had known Marcus was actively taking from the business. And she had calculated her exact word, calculated that saying something to me would cost her more than staying quiet. She said she told herself it was a small thing, that he would eventually stop, that I was so rich I would never notice, or that if I did, it would quietly resolve itself without her ever having to be the one who said it out loud and ruin the peace. She actually quoted her own damning email back to herself. "Be careful, he'll notice eventually." She said she had read that line again recently and hadn't been able to explain to herself how she had become the kind of monster who could write it. Not times stop, not times this is evil, just times be careful. Like the only real concern in her heart was the risk of the gravy train derailing, rather than the fact that her eldest son was robbing her youngest son blind. She said she knew Elena and Marcus had been sleeping together, and had actively told herself it was just a phase. That she hadn't wanted to see what she was clearly seeing because seeing it would require her to act, and acting would mean violently disrupting the only version of reality that worked for her. The version where I kept quietly building the empire, they kept endlessly benefiting from it, and nobody ever examined the rotten foundation too closely. She wrote, "We made you responsible for absolutely everything, and then we fully expected you to absorb the devastating cost of our moral failures too. That wasn't a family, Liam. That was dependency dressed up as love." I finally understood that the morning the sheriff handed us the vacate notice. I just didn't know how to say it until now. And then, at the very end, after all of that brutal confession, "Please come home." I sat with those 3 words for 20 minutes, not because I was actually deciding whether to go. I knew before I even finished reading the first paragraph that I was absolutely never going back. Not to that state, not to that broken dynamic, not to the pathetic version of myself that had kept the whole parasitic arrangement running just because it was easier than asking what I was actually getting in return. I sat with the words because they deserved that much respect. Because my mother had finally written something profoundly true and impossibly difficult, and I wasn't going to dismiss it without actually feeling the heavy weight of it. She was right about most of what she wrote. That was the honest, painful answer. The dependency dressed as love line was terrifyingly accurate in a way that took genuine psychological courage to put into words. I truly believed she meant it. I truly believed she was agonizingly ashamed. I believed that somewhere in the specific, humiliating collapse of the luxurious life they had built entirely around my labor, something had finally become crystal clear to her that comfort had kept blurry for years. None of that changed what going back would mean. I closed the email. I moved it to the trash. I emptied the folder. No reply. Not because I wanted her to suffer the silence maliciously, but because I had absolutely nothing left to say that the last 4 months hadn't already said infinitely more clearly than I ever could in writing. An answer would reopen a negotiation I had already permanently concluded. It would falsely suggest there was still a timeline where the outcome was different. There wasn't, and telling her that directly would have been its own specific kind of cruelty, more personal, more surgical than the silence. The silence, at least, left the shape of things slightly ambiguous. That was the absolute last kindness I had available to give her, so that was exactly where I left it. Marcus took a pathetic plea deal on the felony fraud charges 8 months after the investigation officially opened. The forensic evidence I provided was so overwhelmingly clean that his public defender aggressively advised against going to trial. He received a suspended sentence, mandatory repayment through a massive civil judgment that will garnish his wages forever, and 3 years of strict probation. The private investor lawsuit ran parallel to the criminal case and settled separately. What little assets he had left went entirely toward it. His name in every single professional context I had ever touched was permanently finished. Last I heard through Priya, he had fled to another state and was working a grueling overnight warehouse job. No startups, no consulting, absolutely no access to anyone else's accounts ever again. Elena's situation resolved through a brutal combination of a criminal plea and a massive civil liability finding. She fully cooperated with the investor audit in exchange for slightly reduced charges, which meant she handed over absolutely everything she knew about Marcus's transfers in addition to answering for her own sloppy forgeries. The legal restitution completely wiped out her life savings. The corporate compliance world had slammed its doors shut to her long before any of the legal outcomes were even finalized. Professional networks always move faster than courts. She is currently trying to rebuild somewhere else, in a completely different, lower-tier industry, suffocating under the weight of a financial and reputational reset that will take her decades to work through. Arthur and Helen are still living in that depressing 2-bedroom rental. The wealthy social world they had moved through so easily for decades has contracted in the quiet, permanent way that happens when people withdraw without announcement. Uncle David hasn't spoken to them since receiving the documents. The cousins are coldly polite at a distance when unavoidable family events require proximity, and completely absent otherwise. Helen has stopped being invited to the charity galas and luncheons she used to organize. None of that social exile was something I orchestrated directly. It was just the natural, inevitable result of a dark truth becoming known in a community where reputation had always been the only real currency. They have each other, and they have a specific, agonizingly private understanding of exactly which choices led them to a smaller, quieter, poorer life than the one they had grown so accustomed to. That heavy understanding is going to be sitting in the room with them for the rest of their lives. I am in Charleston now. I rented a beautiful apartment 2 blocks from the water. It is the nicest place I have ever lived in, not because it is massive or overly expensive, but because every single decision made inside its walls is entirely mine. Nobody else has a key. Nobody drops by uninvited to drink my beer. Nobody calls from the living room asking for money while I am trying to think. The logistics business runs flawlessly under the new offshore structure. The new operations director I hired has turned out to be vastly better at the day-to-day internal management than I ever was, which completely freed me up to focus on the high-level client relationships and expansion strategy I had been neglecting for years while I was too busy being everyone's personal financial infrastructure. I am 32. I work hard. I travel when the work calls for it. I am not in any rush to rebuild anything personal, not because I am irreparably damaged or closed off, but because for the absolute first time in a very long time, I am not operating from a massive emotional deficit. I am not giving more of myself than I have. I am not exhausting myself maintaining a fake version of reality that requires me to actively look away from what I am actually seeing. Priya texts occasionally. Nothing heavy, just the normal, casual back and forth of two people who have firmly established that they are on the same side of reality. That is more than enough for me right now. I thought, when I was sitting at that marble kitchen island at 3 a.m. running the financial map, that what I was building toward was revenge. I thought I wanted some deeply satisfying, explosive final act of destruction that would feel like cinematic justice when it finally landed. What it actually felt like was simply removal. I stepped out from under a massive, rotting structure I had been exhausting myself holding up for years. And the structure violently collapsed not because I actively demolished it with a sledgehammer, but because it had absolutely never been capable of standing on its own 2 feet. The collapse wasn't something I maliciously did to them. It was just the reality of what was always true, finally allowed to be visible to the world. Elena once told me my silence scared her infinitely more than anything I could have ever said. My mother's final email was the absolute last test of that theory. I deleted it, closed the laptop, made a cup of black coffee, stood at the massive window while it brewed, and watched the street outside doing its perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning things. A woman walking a golden retriever, a delivery truck idling at the corner, seagulls on a wire doing absolutely nothing in particular. Completely, beautifully ordinary. That was exactly the point. Top comments. User 1. The line dependency dressed up as love is one of the most chillingly accurate descriptions of toxic family dynamics I've ever read. Your mom didn't love you, Liam. She loved what you provided. The fact that she was willing to let your brother steal from you just so she wouldn't have to deal with the drama of confronting him tells you everything. You didn't ruin them. You just stopped being their shield. Good on you for getting out clean. User 2. I am a forensic accountant, and the way you handled that audit and the legal restructuring is pure, unadulterated poetry. Moving the assets to a foreign holding entity before dropping the hammer was a masterstroke. Elena thought her compliance background made her smart, but she forgot the golden rule: never try to outpaper the guy who built the company from the ground up. Enjoy Charleston, you earned every bit of that piece. User 3, the fact that Marcus tried to throw Elena under the bus the second the heat came down, and she immediately retaliated by admitting they were going to drain you and run away together. Absolute chef's kiss. Thieves have no loyalty. It's wild how quickly a family crumbles when the person funding the delusion finally walks away. The silence was the ultimate revenge.